this video, we're going over cost plus invoicing. We'll start by looking at how cost plus jobs are set up, including how markup works during that setup. Then we'll move into the fundamentals of how cost plus jobs operate within BuildExact. And finally, we'll talk about creating invoices, including how to control what your client sees, whether that's more detail, less detail, or additional notes. Jumping into my BuildExact account, and I'm actually going to start back in an estimate and walk through how we take an estimate and turn it into a cost plus job. When I go to create job and select cost plus, the first thing BuildExact asks is, what's the cost plus percent? What that's asking for is the default markup you want applied at the time of invoicing. So if I enter 20% here, that's just the standard markup that will apply by default. But you can absolutely adjust that per invoice line later. For example, you might decide to charge cost only for a specific item to help a client out, or you might vary the percentage depending on the type of work. That 20% just gives you a baseline starting point. Now, it's also worth noting that this cost plus markup is separate from any markup you originally had on the estimate. When you build your estimate, you likely added markup to give the client a realistic idea of the overall cost to complete the project. But when you convert that estimate into a cost plus job, BuildExact brings over all the line items pre-tax and pre-markup. That's because in a cost plus setup, we're applying markup and tax as we go, each time we invoice. If you know ahead of time that a project will be run as a cost plus job, the simplest approach is to use a single overall markup percentage in your estimate. That way, when it's time to invoice, you can just plug in that same percentage and not have to worry about recalculating or cross-checking anything. Everything will automatically apply that default percentage. If, however, you've set up markups per item or per category in your estimate, that's fine too. You'll just need to pay closer attention when invoicing to make sure those different markups are reflected accurately. Now that we've covered that, let's jump into a job I've already set up as a cost plus contract. From here, we'll look at the fundamentals of how cost plus jobs actually function inside BuildExact. Aside from change orders and outgoing invoices, everything else about managing a cost plus job follows the same basic structure as other job types in BuildExact. For cost plus projects, as we mentioned briefly in the change orders video, where we go into more detail, because there's no fixed contract value in cost plus setup, change orders are mainly used to outline the estimated cost of a potential change. Basically, to show the client what it might cost if they decide to modify the project. However, when it comes to actually billing the client, all invoicing in a cost plus job comes directly from your purchase orders and work orders, not from the change order itself. So unless you've told BuildExact that you've spent money on something through a purchase order or a work order, there's nothing for the system to invoice. And just a quick word of caution, while you can manually enter in your totals here, we generally recommend avoiding that. It's technically possible, but it's not feasible in cost plus jobs. Reason being, if you manually type in a figure, that cost isn't tied to a purchase order or a work order, and it won't show up as an option to invoice for. That means you could accidentally miss billing for something you've done. If you think you might have done that in an existing project, it's easy to check. Just click the Show Details on the bottom right corner, and anything listed as Other indicates something that was manually typed in. You'll also see totals for purchase orders and work orders, and those are the ones you want to rely on for cost plus jobs. Ideally, that other total should always be 0. That way, you know everything you're billing for is properly tracked through purchase and work orders, and you're not missing any expenses. Now, one more quick point specific to work orders and notes within them. When you're creating work orders, especially if you're using the BuildExact timesheet app or external tools like Deputy or QuickBooks Time, any notes that were made on the timesheet often get pulled into this instructions box. And we'll quickly talk about how these two fields, the description and the instructions, are used. For cost plus contracts, the description field on your purchase order or work order carries through to your invoice. That's really useful because it gives context to your client. For example, if this was a timesheet for a particular week, you could note that in the description so the client knows exactly what the entry relates to. Or if it's for materials, say timber for framing, it adds clarity to what was purchased. The instructions field then adds an extra layer of detail. You can use it for internal notes, specifics from the timesheet, or anything that helps clarify the work completed when you review or invoice later on. And earlier I mentioned how notes and descriptions can automatically flow through your timesheet apps, things like BuildExact timesheets, Deputy, or QuickBooks Time. When we get to invoicing, I'll show you exactly where those bits of text appear and how they're used on the client-facing invoice. With that said, we'll move into invoicing and also a few helpful tips around that. All right, looking at our list of invoices, there is a status filter here, which lets you sort invoices based on where they're at. For your very first invoice, everything will show under all, so you can simply tick all of them and add them to your invoice. But if you're running a cost-plus job that stretches out over several weeks or months, which is pretty common, we usually prefer using the not invoice filter instead of all. Because what will happen is all will display every single expense that's been added to the job so far, and not invoiced, on the other hand, just picks up the most recent expenses. This makes it much easier to bulk select and add only the new costs into your next invoice. For this first example, though, it doesn't really matter which filter I choose. I'll just grab all of them and click Invoice to pull them in. Each item in the invoice is expandable, so you can easily see where each total comes from and what's included. You'll also notice that my default 20% markup is automatically applied here. But if I need to adjust it for a particular invoice or line item, I can easily do that too. Now, depending on how you bill your clients, you might be sending invoices every 2 weeks, once a month, or on another schedule. Naming your invoices clearly helps keep things organized. Something like August invoice works perfectly fine if you're billing monthly, and if you'd like to include additional comments for your client, you can absolutely do that too. I'll just add a quick note here so you can see where those appear later. And when you're ready, you can either save and close or save and send, which will walk you through one quick confirmation step and then email the invoice right away to the client. Save and close is handy while you're still getting comfortable with things. It lets you preview everything, double check the details, all before sending it out. And a common question we get is, there are 3 print buttons and 3 share buttons. Which one am I supposed to use? The good news is it doesn't really matter. They all lead to the same result. The easiest way to think about it is the buttons in these first few columns relate to individual expenses, showing order numbers and notes tied to each of them. And the columns on the right, meanwhile, are tied to the invoice itself, showing things like the invoice number, description, and status. So use whichever one makes the most sense for the view you're working in. But in this example, all of the line items are tied to the same invoice, my August invoice, which means no matter which one I click, whether it's share, print, or view, they all open the same August invoice. Now, it's worth noting that different businesses handle this a little differently. Some builders choose to share all of their supplier and contractor receipts directly with the client. And if you're doing that, it's a good idea to make sure your invoices are easy to reference. For example, by consistently including a purchase number or supplier name. That way, when the client looks at both the invoice and the attached documents, it's clear which is which. That brings me to the next set of options located here in the little gear button, where we can show cost plus breakdown and show order instructions. When I turn on show cost plus breakdown, the invoice expands to list every individual line that sits under a work order or a purchase order, giving a full breakdown of costs. And when I enable show order instructions, it includes any additional notes or instructions that were added to the original orders, the same ones we talked about earlier. So let's turn on both of these and print it again. And now you can see the invoice is much more detailed. In my example, I had a few notes on the purchase order and some on the work order. Those are now showing up here. And this is especially helpful for timesheet-based work because it gives your client a clear picture of what work actually was involved, not just the cost, but the context behind it. You can mix and match these display options to see which layout you like best. For example, if I turn off the detailed breakdown and leave instructions showing, the invoice looks a bit simpler. It still includes the notes for content, but keeps the layout clean and easy to read. So really, you can adjust it depending on how much detail you want your client to see. All right, that covers the main ways you can present your cost plus invoices. Now, just a quick bonus tip that I've also mentioned in our other videos for fixed price and completion percentage invoicing. When you go to share an invoice, BuildExact will ask what you'd like to send: the invoice, the statement, or both. For cost plus jobs, we find the invoice statement especially useful. Because cost plus jobs invoices are often generated on a rolling basis, weekly, bi-weekly, monthly, the statement acts as a running record of everything that's been billed to date. For your very first invoice, there won't be much to see, but as time goes on, a few weeks, a few months, or even a year into the job, that statement becomes a really handy reference. It gives both you and your client a clear history of what's been billed and when, alongside the total amounts for each invoice. And that is all for cost plus invoicing and how it works in BuildExact. But as always, if you have any questions, please let us know.